Oh God. Okay. Zoom is a fantastic piece of software. Yeah. So I took the freedom to rename the talk a little bit, but it's the same talk anyways. I wanted to call it JavaScript SEO a guided tour, and I'm really excited to talk to you for the next 30 minutes. Are we ready to rumble? Silence. I'm assuming we're ready to rumble, so I'll just. Oh, excellent. Sweet. Yeah, well, hello and welcome everybody to this wonderful guided tour through JavaScript for SEOs. Super excited to be here. Today we're going to cover a lot of ground, so I'll be quick. First things first, I want to clarify a little bit what JavaScript has impact on SEO and which JavaScript does not really have impact on SEO, because JavaScript is a programming language that can be used for lots of different things, and depending on how you use your JavaScript, this might or might not have an impact on your SEO efforts. Then we talk a little bit about different web application architectures as they exist as of today. And then we look into how Googlebot deals with JavaScript specifically. And last but not least, I want to go through some of the common issues that we are seeing when JavaScript is evolved and go over possible solutions for those. Right. Now with that, as I said, JavaScript is just a general purpose programming language, and it can be used for all sorts of things, including programming just like with Python or Java or PHP. It doesn't even have to run in the browser. It can run on a microcontroller, but that's not the stuff that you would worry about. If you look at classical classical websites, there was a very strict separation between the server side on one end and the client side on the other end. The client side is everything that happens in your browser. So as far as you as the website owner is concerned, you don't really have that much control over this, because it can be any kind of device that can run a browser. It could be a fridge for all you know. It could be a phone. It could be a tablet. It could be a computer. You don't really make assumptions about that. But then on the server side, that's the environment that you have full control over, because you control your server after all, right? The way that used to work is you have some data source, like a database or a bunch of files, and you have some templates, and then the data gets put into these templates by a program that runs on your server, written in a server-side language, such as Java, PHP, Python, Perl, what have you. Note that Node.js is a variety of JavaScript that actually also runs on the server. So you could use JavaScript on the server side. Then the server would haul over that HTML and the content and all the images and everything that is in the page to the browser, and the browser would then basically display the page. As you can tell, whatever happens on the server side does not really matter to the client. And if you think about it, browsers for users is one client, but search engines is another client, because search engines do fundamentally what your users do. They are a client to your web server. They request things from your website and then do something with them. Users usually browse them, like click on things and stuff. And search engines usually try to understand what they are about, if they're good on the topic, and then put them into the index, into the database. As I have mentioned, the JavaScript on the server side, in this case, has no implications neither on the client nor on the search engines, because search engines are not even aware that there is JavaScript involved. So you can build your backend with JavaScript all you want. No search engine whatsoever would know and would care about that, because, you know, as far as the client is concerned, they just get HTML, all the same. It doesn't really matter if it's Java or Python or JavaScript generating this HTML. So server-side JavaScript is not really a problem for anyone who does SEO, because you don't have to worry about that whatsoever. As long as the HTML that is created has all the content in, you don't need to worry about it. And then there's JavaScript that runs in the browser. That's the classical client-side JavaScript. But client-side JavaScript is not all the same. So in this case, we probably have some form that lets us select a category of Chuck Norris jokes, and then there's like a list of Chuck Norris jokes, and then there's like some JavaScript that basically just moves things around. So all the content is in the HTML, but now we have some JavaScript that might hide some of the content visually, or, you know, sort them differently or add something to the list that hasn't been there before, but all the content has been there, maybe not just visible. So it might make things invisible, it might make things visible, but the content is all there. So again, because the content is all there, and JavaScript and search engines don't care too much about visibility in the sense of, is it visible to the human eye? It cares a little bit, but not too much. So again, this kind of JavaScript, which I would call cosmetic JavaScript, doesn't matter. And you can think of this as like JavaScript that, I don't know, organizes things in tabs, or JavaScript that lets you add like little snowflakes falling from the top of your page. Search engines don't care because the content is there nonetheless. Even if you disable JavaScript, all the content is there. If I disable JavaScript on the previous website, all the jokes would still show. I just couldn't sort them or filter them by category. But that's kind of cosmetic, and search engines don't care, so you don't have to worry about that as an SEO either. But then what is JavaScript that you as an SEO need to worry about, or at least be aware of? Right? What is it that you need to know when JavaScript is involved to make sure that search engines such as Google actually understand what's going on and see your content? That brings us to the lovely, lovely topic of web application architectures. And web application architectures is about how developers structure and run their web applications in the browser. The classical single-page application that you probably heard beforehand is relatively visible by behaving more like an app than a website. So in this case, for instance, no matter if I click on dogs or cats, it just changes the images. If I scroll, it loads more images as I scroll down. So it's like an infinite scroll. But it doesn't really reload the website. So it's not that I click on dogs and then the entire thing goes blank for a moment and then dogs appear. It's like the entire static shell, so to speak. So the entire menu, everything around the main content stays visible at all times. And then just the content changes and it doesn't like reload the page entirely. It just changes content whenever I want to do something here, but it doesn't really reload the entire page. And also, if you were to disable JavaScript, you might see the menu and the header, but you will definitely not see the dogs or cats in this case, because JavaScript manages all the content that is on the page. And this is why you should be aware of this JavaScript happening on your page, because as an SEO, you should be concerned with the content that is on the pages, right? That should be what you look at. You should make sure that all the content is there, all the content is well structured, all the content is relevant, has the relevant links, has inbound links. All this kind of stuff is something that you want to make sure and want to care about for your pages. So if all the content is now managed by JavaScript, that is something that you need to be aware of and manage, because JavaScript errors or JavaScript problems can now actually effectively make it so that users might be seeing something and might get the content, but search engines might not get the content. And for Google search, that is not as much of a problem, and for other search engines, it's increasingly less of a problem. But for instance, social network sharing bots, the ones that allow you to specify these like little meta tags with like a preview image and all that kind of stuff, they might not run JavaScript. And if they don't run JavaScript, that means that this content might actually not be visible to these bots. And then the share to the social networks might not look what you expect it to look like. Okay, so because of this, we need to understand what this does and why it matters and how it works. Okay, so why it matters, we have discussed, because it's in charge of all the content. How does it work, though? Well, if you look at a single-page application in the browser's developer tools, and you go to the network tab and you say, like, show me only document requests, so only when it loads pages, basically, and you click on something and the content changes even drastically, in this case, it changes between dogs and cats, you see that on the right-hand side there is no second request happening. Like this, there is some network activity, but it's not a page request, it's not a document request. If I were to switch the filter to all, you would see that some JavaScript is happening in the background and it's loading different data, but it doesn't really load a separate page. Interesting. And then we look at three different architectures roughly. The first one being a client-side rendered single-page application. So we already discussed client-side JavaScript is JavaScript that runs in the client, or is in the browser, or in the search engine bot for that matter. But how does a client-side rendered single-page application work? Well, roughly it works like this. You request a page, maybe the home page. Let's say you go to the homepage of your website, and on the server on the left in this picture are the templates to show content, and then the data that the content actually is. And when I request this in the browser, my phone gets basically the template and some JavaScript. And then the JavaScript requests all the data that it needs to put into this content. Into this template, and then only then we have content. This has a few big implications. Number one, if JavaScript fails to fetch the content or put it in the template correctly, as far as the client is concerned, there is no content. If I'm disabling JavaScript in this application, no content whatsoever will show up. It won't even be in the HTML, it just won't be there. So that's bad. That's effectively sending a blank page to people who are not having JavaScript enabled. Luckily for you, most search engines have JavaScript enabled. Google Search for sure has. So that shouldn't be much of a problem unless there are errors or mistakes in the JavaScript that might break it so that it doesn't actually load the content. The second implication here is, as my browser loads the HTML, because it's just the template, it can't really show me anything. It then also needs to download the JavaScript, and then also needs to run the JavaScript. It then needs to also download the actual content, and only then can it show me data. That sounds pretty involved, doesn't it? It sounds like a lot of steps just to get to content. That's because it is. If you compare that to a classical server-side rendered website, in the server-side rendered world, or in the server-side world where the JavaScript runs on the server side, the request comes in and HTML goes immediately out containing everything that is in the content. So as the HTML arrives in the browser, content can be shown. Sounds like less work, doesn't it? That's because it is less work. And actually, that is a performance implication that you need to just be aware of. This is a limitation of client-side rendered applications. They might take longer to actually initially paint content. And if you listen carefully to the Web Vitals talk previously, the core Web Vitals talk, you know that how fast something that shows up on screen is actually important for performance and user experience. Right, so that's client-side rendering. That's great. This is how it would look if you go view source on a page and you see something like this. That is a very, very typical example of a client-side rendered single-page application. Here is a placeholder, and then a bunch of JavaScript runs, and then the JavaScript actually produces the content that you see on screen. Very, very typical thing. Google Search does not have a problem with that. We can see the content that is produced by JavaScript. We can index it. That's not an issue. But that is, unless something is broken in your JavaScript. If you have broken JavaScript, then this can actually ruin your experience. And then we have server-side rendering. I already pre-highlighted that one in the previous talk. Here, the template and the data is in the previous section, I mean. The templates and the data are being combined into content on the server side, and then the static content is just directly delivered to the browser and the client. And then you just see the content. So it's a little faster. The downside is, with the client-side application, you can have very dynamic behavior, very, very interactive, engaging content, because the JavaScript can respond to events. Here, the JavaScript runs on the server, so it doesn't know if someone on the phone is tapping on a button or is like doing something. So you basically lose a lot of the interactivity, but for pages that are relatively static, like marketing pages, blog posts, that doesn't really matter because they are not that interactive to begin with. But if you have content like, I don't know, a 3D computer-aided design, so CAD application that runs in the browser, then this interactivity and this functionality that makes it into an application is delivered by JavaScript. So server-side rendering is not really an option for those. But there's a third one, which I like to call hybrid rendering or universal JavaScript. Sometimes it's also referred to as hydration. And hydration means that you do have the server-side JavaScript that creates the initial version of the content, but then we show the content in the the client, but we also run some JavaScript should there be an interaction. If there is an interaction, then more or other content can be loaded upon interaction. This is great for users. This is great for improving performance and making sure content shows up early, but it also means a lot of work to make this work on the engineering side of things. It also means that if content is only visible after user interaction, search engines won't see it, because search engines in general, as far as I can only speak for Google search here. For Google search, I know Google search does not interact with the content. We don't click buttons, we don't scroll. Scrolling is a little bit of a weird topic. There's guidance on developers.google.com/search, but in general, we don't interact with the page. So if, let's say, like a load more button loads more content and shows more content that hasn't been there before, then this content might be invisible to search engines. Again, driving home the point of performance, especially tying into Andre's talk previously, if you are using a hybrid or server-side rendering, you get the content significantly faster, 1 to 2 seconds faster, maybe even 3 seconds faster. I've seen that before. And if my goal here as a user is to see an image of a cat, then that is 3 more cat-filled seconds of my life, which is always important and fantastic. Let's give a quick overview of the 3 different architectures real quick. Client-side rendering has the downside that without JavaScript, you don't get any content. The nice thing is that usually pretty much every JavaScript framework out there that developers might be using has it as a default. So like by default, it's very easy to build client-side rendered single-page apps, but that comes with a bunch of potential speed issues that you might be aware of, and you might need to make sure that you have mitigation in place to make sure that it doesn't actually affect your bottom line. Server-side rendering does not need JavaScript because the JavaScript is executed in your server environment so that it doesn't become a problem. That is usually not the default. So if it hasn't been built in from the beginning of the project, then adding that into an existing project is a lot more work than is often feasible. So it does need code changes. And it also has potential problems in terms of interactivity because you lose a lot of the interactivity. You're back to an old style website where, for instance, a click on a link actually refreshes the page. So there is a flash of blank screen in between interactions. So might work, might not work. Depends a little bit on what kind of page you're building. And then the hybrid makes JavaScript mostly optional to show the initial content. Does require a little bit of work, especially if it's a pre-existing project. If you start a new project, look for solutions that have hydration built in and use that from the get-go, something like Next.js or Nuxt.js if you're more in the Angular world than the React world, or Angular Universal. It is kind of the best of both worlds, but it comes with additional complexity, so it might be requiring more engineering resources than the other two. So as usual in the real world, everything has pros and cons, so you need to be carefully choosing the right technology for you. Okay, I talked about basically the engineering side of things, but what about SEO? Well, actually, let's see into how Googlebot deals with this JavaScript then. So at the first stage, we have a crawler that makes requests to servers to get the data that is behind the URL. This HTML that comes back initially is then processed. So we try to understand what the content is and what it's about and if it's good or not. We also look for all the links in the initial HTML and we pass that straight back to the crawler so that we can discover more pages from the linked URLs in the HTML. And then the HTML is also passed into what we call a renderer. And the renderer is basically a Chrome browser running on our servers that then actually executes all the JavaScript and passes back the rendered HTML. So the HTML after all the JavaScript has run. Remember the client-side application thing where it had like a placeholder and then some JavaScript? Assuming that the JavaScript loads all the content, all the images, all the pictures, all the videos, all the text, then the rendered HTML will contain all of that after the JavaScript has run, and we can process it again. Obviously, if we find links in that one, then we actually load those links as well. And then also we pass on the data to our index. So then it gets stored into our index and then can potentially be ranked for queries. Specifically, don't show ranking here because ranking is not something that is directly influenced by JavaScript whatsoever. Not directly, but obviously indirectly, because if your JavaScript breaks and we can't see your content, then that content can't be indexed, and if it's not indexed, it can't be ranked. So JavaScript runs in rendering. If the links only show up after JavaScript runs, we can't pass on these links very early on, so it might take longer for us to discover things. Rendering does not happen immediately. It might take a few seconds to a few minutes until rendering is actually happening. And there's a bunch of common pitfalls that JavaScript can cause in rendering specifically, but in general as well. So let's look at a few typical issues. With this one, I made myself. Like this is, as a developer, I built something that actually suffered from this problem. So assume that I don't want a page indexed. Well, if I don't want a page indexed as a developer, I can have a noindex tag in here. And then once I load the data and find out, oh, actually, this is data that I want to show and I want to index, I want to show to search engines, I want to index in search engines, then I could use JavaScript to get this meta tag and remove it, right? Because then if it's removed, there's no more no index after running the JavaScript. So after running the JavaScript, after rendering in Google's Google Chrome, in Googlebot's Chrome instance, it will be indexed, right? Wrong, unfortunately wrong, because what really happens is the crawler gets this initial HTML that contains the noindex. The processor looks at it, figures out, oh, this doesn't want to be in the index, and stops the process. So pages that tell us right away that they don't want to be indexed are not being rendered. So if you want to do this kind of thing in a client-side rendered application, the way to do it is to dynamically add a noindex, because in this case, we would process the HTML without the noindex, we would render it, then the JavaScript adds a noindex, and then the added noindex would be processed again, and then it would actually still not land up in the or end up in the index, but it would actually be processed and rendered properly. So that's a fun one. The other thing are soft 404s. Soft 404s often happen in client-side rendered single-page applications. Why is that? Because if I go to a URL that doesn't exist, I'm getting an error page here. It says this page does not, oops, this page does not exist. We should be fine, right? This clearly is an error page. Well, except if we are looking at what we get from the server doesn't know, because JavaScript is in charge of the content. So the server says to whatever URL is being thrown, says, yes, this page potentially exists. And then the JavaScript figures out, oh, no, this page doesn't exist. But the server has already responded 200 OK. So we can't change that. So we're a bit screwed, are we not? Well, we are not entirely screwed. Conveniently, it's not a big problem because there's solutions. One such solution is to actually, instead of doing this, where we basically in our single page application, we say like, okay, so if we go to any page that we don't have specified beforehand, then we show the oops component, which shows an error message. We might actually try to set up a proper 404 page on the server. So we have like, at least like say /not found or something, or /404 that actually delivers a 404 and a static page. And then if we are in this oops component, we are doing a JavaScript redirect to the page, to the URL, where the server responds with a 404. That way, Googlebot will handle this page as a redirect to this other page, and this other page is a 404, so the page that redirects us there is also a 404. That way you can avoid this problem whatsoever. There's also sneaky 404s, particularly in progressive web apps or PWAs. What is that? So I am on a page that looks fantastic, and I click on a doggo, and it works, and like, so, okay, fantastic. Now I take this link to the specific doggo, and I go into an incognito tab, and I enter that, and out comes the 404 response from the server. So this is actually not a JavaScript problem. This is actually a server setup problem, but it comes from the fact that JavaScript might hide this when testing. What happens here? Why does this work unless I go into a incognito tab? Well, what happens there is normally the browser makes a request to the server, and then the server responds with some HTML and JavaScript. In progressive web apps, however, it also installs a piece of JavaScript that is called a service worker. And the service worker, what it does is basically whenever the browser requests something, the service worker gets to decide what happens. And now the service worker was very, very clever, and JavaScript being in charge of the content, so it knows where to actually get the real content for this docs detail page, and then it actually gives you the new content, and the server doesn't even know. The server never gets asked. The browser thinks it asks the server, but it asks our piece of JavaScript, our service worker. The service worker does this. Why do we do that? Because that allows offline access. If you ever wondered how some websites work offline, this is how. They're basically storing a copy, and then the JavaScript, that is the service worker here, figures out, okay, so I'll just take it from the copy and update the copy in the background whenever I have network again. And that's how offline websites work. And it's great. The problem is if there's a new user that has never installed this JavaScript, has never installed the service worker, and you install the service worker by going to a page that has one. So we're going to this website for the very first time. We've not installed a service worker. And so the server gets asked for this content. The server is misconfigured, it's wrongly configured, and actually responds with a 404 because it doesn't know how to handle this request. So I don't see it as a user who comes to the website's homepage and then navigate through. But whenever I send a link that goes directly to one of the sub pages of my website, then I'm ending up in this place where unfortunately I'm getting 404 errors. If that happens, check your server configuration, make sure that your service workers are well implemented so that you can actually disable them and try out without a service worker. Also look for the HTTP status code that comes back. Chrome DevTools tell you if the response came from a service worker rather than from the server, so that helps debugging a little bit. Also, missing content might happen, right? I've allured to that a few times. You can check if content is showing up by going to the mobile-friendly test, check for loading issues, but also, most importantly, check the screenshot if it looks more or less fine. This does not look fine. And also check the JavaScript error console, and also check the rendered HTML. Actually, more than the screenshot, I would rather have you check the rendered HTML. If the content is in the rendered HTML, then you should be fine. You can use the JavaScript console messages to debug if there is anything gone wrong with JavaScript. Send that to your developers, they'll look into it for you. Can be that there's a JavaScript error while loading the content. It can be that there's something that times out, or some critical scripts don't work for some reason, maybe HTTPS versus HTTP, for instance. This is no longer relevant. I don't know why I still have it in here, though. There is a workaround. Yes, I'll finish in a minute, actually. There's a workaround called dynamic rendering, where basically you are pre-rendering things just for crawlers. We don't recommend that, but you can use it if you really, really have to. The easiest solution would be to use Rendertron. There's other solutions, paid solutions as well as Puppeteer. But again, use that only if none of the other things that you can do work. If you really, really have problems, need a solution now. Now it's a Band-Aid. It's a workaround. It's not a solution for the longer term. Here's an example of how that would look like. If we can't see certain links, then be aware that fragment links, like the red ones here, might not work. So use the history API. It works in all of those browsers, basically. And use proper link markup. That's a proper link. That's a proper link. That's not really a proper link because it doesn't have an href to go to. So you can't make a network request to that. That is the same page as we are on in the href. So this link gets ignored as well. That's, again, not a URL that you can make a network request to. So this is ignored. Better, but weird. No, that's not even a link. That's no. So please just use normal links. You can spice them up with JavaScript, but use normal links with an href that is a resolvable URL. So to sum it up, it is fine to use JavaScript. It's even fine to build single-page applications that use client-side JavaScript. But you need to test a little more, and you need to be a little more careful. Often the JavaScript issues are not just SEO issues, but also user experience issues. And if everything else fails, you can do dynamic rendering, but we would advise against it. We have a bunch of tools like the Search Console, mobile-friendly test, rich results test. use them. Developers often don't know about them. So if you find yourself struggling with having developers test properly, show them these tools so that they can benefit from the tools as well. And make sure that you have proper URLs and links in your HTML markup. And with that, I'd like to say thank you very, very much. Have a great time and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Oh, Martin, thank you. Андрей Липацев, давай мы вместе с тобой подключимся.
Привет, привет. Hey, Martin. Good to have you here.
Hi, Andrei.
Dude, it's the first time we're on stage together.
Yeah, it's true. And unfortunately, not a real stage. It would be so nice to actually see you in person again.
Next time, hopefully.
Mm-hmm.